with verse 1. And I'll read several verses that will set the context and the stage for our thoughts this morning. John 13, look with me at verse 1. Now before the feast of the Passover, when Jesus knew that his hour was come, that he should depart out of this world unto the Father, having loved his own which were in the world, he loved them unto the end. And supper being ended, the devil having now put into the heart of Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, to betray him, and Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he was come from God and went to God, he riseth from supper, and lay aside his garments, and took a towel, and girded himself. After that he had poured water into a basin, and began to wash the disciples' feet, and to wipe them with the towel wherewith he was girded. Then cometh he to Simon Peter, and Peter said unto him, Lord, dost thou wash my feet? And Jesus answered and said unto him, What I do now thou knowest not, but thou shalt know hereafter. And Peter said unto him, Thou shalt never wash my feet. And Jesus answered him, If I wash thee not, thou hast no part with me. Simon Peter said unto him, Lord, not my feet only, but also my hands and my head. May the Lord's rich blessing be upon his word. May it be sanctified in the hearts and the minds of God's people. I want to talk to you this morning from the subject of the significance of the cross and the power of the resurrection. The significance of the cross and the power of the resurrection. Now, you know, there are some dirty jobs that nobody likes to do. No one likes to take out the trash. When I was a child, it was one of my chores, only one of my chores to take out the trash. And my mother would always say, son, the trash is climbing up the wall. When are you going to take it out? And so I delegated to my son the same job that I had as a boy, to take out the trash. And my dear friend and confidant, Brother Al Perry, told me how he was able to convince his son that it was a noble thing to take out the trash. And so he sent his boys down and he says, now, boys, life is all about responsibilities. And he says, and you cannot take on more responsibility until you train someone to backfill for you. He said, so like standing on an X, and I can't move to the next X until someone can do the job at this X. He says, now I have become tremendously skilled at taking out the trash. I know how to compact it into the bag to get the maximum amount in the bag. I know how to get it out of the can without spilling anything on the floor and thus aggravating your mother. He said, there's absolutely nothing else that I can learn about taking out the trash. But he says, I can't move on to the next level of my responsibility until one of you backfill and take my place. He said, now taking out the trash is a noble thing. Yeah. It's a noble thing. And it can prepare you for greatness. Yeah. Well, his sons, Tyrone, who was here this morning, and Kevin and Eric, they boarded hook, line, and sinker. And they became very faithful at taking out the trash. It's a noble thing. It's a dirty job no one will volunteer for. At my house, one of the great struggles is who's going to wash the dishes. And my wife, she's washed so many dishes, it's a shame. And it's amazing to me how I can be away from the home, my wife can be away from the home, we come back, and the sink is full of dirty dishes, but no one ate anything. I didn't dirty up nothing. I didn't eat anything. And no one ever wants to volunteer to wash the dishes. That's one of those dirty jobs that no one wants. When my children were younger, and I would try to help my wife bathe them and get them ready for school and for church. But there was one job I didn't particularly like. It was the job that God humbled me with and reminded me that from dust I am and from dust I shall return. And did not read my press clippings about what a great preacher I was. I would come home from work and dinner would always be prepared and I would sit down to eat. And in the middle of my dinner, I would notice that one of my little children, and they were all right there together, had slipped away from the table. About the time they were being potty trained. You know, they get the first part down. They can make it to the pot. But now after they've made it there and did their business, they don't know what to do next. And so I never will forget that I'd be sitting at the dinner table and I would hear the toilet flush, and I would hear this voice echoing through the corridors of the restroom in the hallway, "Dad, I'm finished." And that was my cue to rise from my dinner, take care of my children. It was a job I didn't like at the time, but I would love to see those days return, to be able to serve my children in that way. There's some jobs that appear to be dirty jobs, thankless jobs, but they're noble jobs. Such was the case in our text. The Bible says in verse 1 of chapter 13 of John that now before the feast of the Passover, and the feast of the Passover, it was the high day, the highest day on the Jewish calendar. When they observed, they remembered how God had blessed them when they were slaves in Egypt, and how when the death angel had passed over Egypt, how God made a difference between the Jews and between the Egyptians. And when there was death in the home of every Egyptian home, the death angel passed over the homes of the Jews, and all their children were spared. And God instructed them that they were to observe the Passover as a memorial. They were to remember that God made a difference between his people and the other peoples. This week we had the privilege, some of us who went to the Christian Missionary Alliance Church, and we observed Passover, and it took on a great new meaning and significance for myself. And so we vowed that next year, Brother Zach Crabtree and Sister Patsy and Sister Nancy Hill and Sister Pat Bannerman, we're going to plan, and we as a church are going to observe Passover so we can see the Christian significance. It will make it so meaningful and so rich for you. And so Jesus was there with his disciples, and they were observing Passover. And Passover, it was a fairly lengthy process, and there were 4 cups that they would pass, and they would drink from the cups, and they would recite things that God had done for them in the past. They went through this ritual, and toward the end of the Passover observance, they would eat a meal, a dinner, before the passing of the final cup, and they would break bread together. And the text says that after they had broken bread together, after they had eaten dinner, that Jesus, who knew that his hour was now come, he was to depart out of the world. He knew that he was God in the flesh, that all power was at his disposal. He knew that God loved him, and he knew how much he loved the disciples. He loved them to the end. And the enemy already having moved into the heart of Judas Iscariot to betray him, and Jesus, knowing that his own death was imminent, Jesus, knowing that he was about to face the cross and the horror of the cross and the judgment of the cross, and he'll be nailed to the cross, and all of the sins of all of the people of all of time and their punishment will be placed upon him, being fully cognizant of that reality. Jesus was not some deranged man. He was fully aware of what he was doing, and fully aware of the implication of his life and of his ministry and of his pending death. And the Bible says, with all of that in his conscious mind, that he rises up from the table, takes a basin of water, he lays aside his outer garment, he girts himself, and he takes up a towel, and he moves to his disciples' feet. Now, the significance of this act is that in ancient Palestine, they were not blessed to have paved roads and sidewalks like we have, and so it was dusty during the dry season. It was muddy during the rain season, and so when you showed up at someone's home for dinner, your feet would be dusty or they would be muddy because they wore, for the most part, open shoes. We would call them sandals. And so it was the responsibility of the host that when his guest showed up at his home for dinner, that he was to have one of his servants or one of his children or someone in his family was to wash his guests' feet before they had dinner. And not only was it a demonstration of honor and love and respect, but it also was for hygienic purposes. Because in ancient Palestine, when they ate, they would very often eat from a table that was only about 18 inches off of the floor. And the pictures that we see of the Last Supper, they are not historically accurate. They were not sitting at a table the way we sit at a table. They were lying, they were reclining on the floor. And that's the way they would often eat their meals. And so you have around this table, 18 inches off the floor, you have these 13 men, and they're there observing Passover, eating dinner with each other. And so that means that somebody's